The blind man had been sitting on those steps for 11 days before anyone learned his name. He sat in the same spot every morning. Bottom step, left side. A tin cup between his shoes and a strip of cardboard across his knees, with 4 words written on it in a stranger's handwriting, because he could not see to write them himself. I can still work. January 1960, Memphis, Tennessee. The steps of a Veterans Administration hospital, 200 miles up the river from the Mississippi cotton country where the man was born. It is 34 degrees and spitting a cold rain, and the people climbing those steps step around him, because a begging man is an embarrassment, and a blind begging man is worse, and a blind black begging man in Memphis in 1960 is a thing the city has trained itself not to see at all. His name is Cornelius Foss. Everyone who ever loved him called him Neely. He is 38 years old. He has no eyes, not really. What's behind the dark glasses is what a mortar does to a man's face. And here is the fact that should stop you cold. The fact nobody on those steps knows yet. The hospital he is begging in front of is the same hospital that owes him everything. He earned the right to walk through those doors in blood, on a frozen ridge in Korea, where he dragged 11 wounded men out of fire before the shell found him, and they will not let him in. A black Cadillac slows at the curb across the street. It has been there 20 minutes. A tall man sits behind the wheel, watching the blind man on the steps, his big hands tight on the wheel, his jaw working like a man chewing on something that won't go down. A nurse coming out the doors glances at the car and frowns like she half knows the face. Nobody recognizes him yet. Here is the story. To understand how a hero ends up with a tin cup, you have to go back to where Neely Foss began. He was born in 1921 in Coahoma County, Mississippi, in the flat black dirt cotton country south of the river, the 4th of 7 children on 40 acres. His grandfather had bought $1 heartbreaking at a time. That land mattered. In a place and a time when men like the Fosses were told 100 ways a day that they would own nothing, the Foss family owned land, 40 acres, a mule, a deed in a fireproof box, and a quiet, dangerous pride that came with it. Neely was the smart one. Everybody said so. He read everything he could get his hands on. He wanted to be a doctor, an impossible dream for a sharecropper's grandson in the Mississippi Delta, and he knew it, and he wanted it anyway. The army gave him the nearest thing. When Korea came, Neely volunteered, and they made him a combat medic. And on the ridges and in the frozen paddies he became something close to the doctor he'd dreamed of being. His outfit had a name for him. They called him Preacher because he prayed over the ones he couldn't save, and he never, ever left a man behind. He earned the Bronze Star at a place the maps called Hill 77, but to understand what that name cost him, you have to be there for it. November 1952, 12 degrees below freezing. The snow on Hill 717 was the color of dirty bone. Neely's company had pushed up the slope at first light and walked straight into a crossfire. By mid-morning the assault was broken, men down all over the open ground between the rocks, the survivors pinned behind anything that would stop a bullet, and the Chinese mortars finding the range, one round at a time, walking up the hill like a giant taking slow steps. A wounded man in the open is a clock. He has minutes. The cold takes him if the blood loss doesn't. And the unwritten arithmetic of that hill was simple and merciless. Anyone who went out for him would likely become a second man in the open. Neely Foss did the arithmetic and went anyway. The first man he reached was a kid from Ohio with his hip opened up. Neely packed the wound with snow and his own undershirt and dragged him back by the collar, low, the rounds cracking the air a foot over his helmet. He laid the kid behind the rocks and turned around and went back out. That was 1. He went out for the radio man whose legs wouldn't work. 2. He went out for a sergeant who'd been hit twice and was cursing God in 3 languages. 3. The mortars kept walking. Each trip the open ground was a little more torn up, a little more zeroed, and each trip Neely's lieutenant screamed at him to stay down, and each trip Neely pretended not to hear, because Preacher did not leave men in the snow. 4, 5, 6. His hands stopped feeling the cold, which is a bad sign in a medic, and he ignored that too. By the 10th man, the hill had gone quiet in Neely's ears. That strange tunnel quiet that comes when a body has decided it is going to spend everything it has. The 10th man was a tall white boy with his left leg torn nearly through, screaming for his mother, and then, when Neely got a shoulder under him, apologizing, I'm sorry, I'm so heavy, I'm sorry, all the way back across the open ground. Neely laid him down with the others. The boy grabbed his sleeve. "Don't go back out. Please, you've done enough." There was an 11th man still out there moving. Neely went back out. He got the 11th man halfway home when the giant took its last step. The round landed close enough to lift both of them off the snow. Neely felt the heat and the white, and then nothing where his eyes had been. He did not let go of the man. He dragged him the last 10 yards blind, by feel, by the sound of the others shouting him in, and he laid the 11th man behind the rocks, and then sat down in the snow, because the world had gone out like a lamp. 11 men, 11 trips. They put him in for the Bronze Star, and shipped what was left of his face to a hospital in Tokyo. That tall white boy, the 10th man, the one who apologized for being heavy, kept screaming Neely's nickname as they carried Neely down off the hill. Preacher. His name's Preacher. Somebody find out his name. Nobody did. Not for 8 years. Hold on to that boy. He is going to matter more than you can guess. Neely came back to America a decorated, blinded combat hero in 1953, and here is what waited for him. His mother had died while he was overseas. His brothers had scattered to Chicago and Detroit, and the 40 acres, the land, the deed, the family's whole proud reason for standing up straight, was gone. Sold at a county tax auction while he was in a hospital in Tokyo, learning to live without his eyes. That word, sold, hides a crime. In the spring of 1952, while Neely was on Hill 717 and his mother was dying, the Foss tax bill came due, $18. 18. The family had always paid it, but the notice was supposed to go to the farm, and somehow it went nowhere, and the $18 went unpaid, and a clerk in the Coahoma County Courthouse named Earl Pickett noticed. Earl Pickett had a brother-in-law who bought land cheap, and Earl Pickett knew that 40 acres of good Delta dirt was worth a great deal more than $18 in back taxes. So Earl let the clock run, posted the auction notice where no Foss would see it, and on a Tuesday morning in front of 3 men who were all in on it, the brother-in-law bought the Foss farm for the cost of the taxes and a handshake. And then Earl Pickett did the thing that turned a sharp deal into a theft. He went into the courthouse records and he pulled the original Foss deed, the proof that the land had been bought and paid for free and clear by Neely's grandfather decades before, the proof that might have let a returning soldier fight the sale, and that deed simply ceased to exist. The fireproof box at the farm was empty. The courthouse file was empty. As far as the paper of the world was concerned, the Foss family had never owned anything at all. Earl Pickett went home that night and slept fine. That is the part you have to understand about how these things happen. The men who do them sleep fine. So Neely Foss came home a hero to a country that had lost his land and could not find his paperwork. He had a Bronze Star, a ruined face, and a county that had erased 40 years of his family with a missing piece of paper. It should have been the floor he stood on. Instead, it was the first thing they took. Then there was the pension, and this is where the cruelty gets quiet and procedural, the way real cruelty usually is. Neely's injuries entitled him to a full disability pension, a blind combat veteran, total and permanent. It should have been automatic. It should have been the one thing in America that worked. It did not work. His file had a flaw. When he was wounded, in the chaos of the field hospital, a clerk had recorded his name as Cornelius Ross instead of Foss. One letter, a wet pencil, a tired hand, and that one letter became a wall. The Memphis VA had a service record for a blind combat medic named Cornelius Foss, and a wound record for a Cornelius Ross, and the bureaucracy would not marry the two without a chain of documents that Neely, blind, broke, with no family and no home, could not assemble. The man who handled his case was named Howard Beckworth, a claims adjudicator, GS9, 51 years old, and Howard Beckworth was not a cruel man. He was something more useful to a cruel system, a man who had stopped letting himself feel anything about the names in the files. Neely came to his office that January. He'd hitchhiked the last 40 miles. He stood in front of Beckworth's desk in a coat with no buttons, and Beckworth read the file aloud in the flat voice of a man who'd read 10,000 of them. "Mr. Foss, I've gone through it. The service record's solid. Bronze Star, the whole thing, no question. But the wound record is filed under Ross. Until those two are reconciled with certified documentation, I cannot release a payment. It's not that I doubt you. It's that the file doesn't agree with itself. I'm standing right here," Neely said quietly. "I can recite the men I carried off Hill 717, 11 names. Want to hear them? I believe you, Mr. Foss. That's not the question. The question is whether the paper agrees, and the paper doesn't. And I can't pay out on paper that doesn't agree. I didn't make the rule. Beckworth closed the folder. Bring me a certified correction from the Department of the Army, a notarized affidavit of identity, and your discharge in the matching name, and I can process it in 90 days. And how does a blind man with no money and no family, Neely asked, get certified papers from the Army? I understand it's difficult. How? Beckworth was quiet a moment. Then he gave the only honest answer the system had. I don't know, Mr. Foss. There's a process for it. The process assumes you have help. If you don't have help, he stopped. There's nobody for you to be angry at here. There's just the file, and the file is the file. There's nobody for you to be angry at. It's the same sentence cruelty always uses, in 1,000 offices, to 1,000 people. It means no one will be blamed, so no one will help. Neely Foss stood there in the buttonless coat. He had nothing. No eyes, no land, no money, no name the paper would agree to. He dragged 11 men out of fire and the country couldn't find a single piece of paper to drag him out of the dark. He turned and felt for the wall and let himself out. The next morning, he sat down on the bottom step with a tin cup, because a man has to eat and there was nothing left to do but ask. That was 11 days ago. I need you to stop scrolling for 1 second. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your state in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to see how far Neely Fotz's name travels tonight, after 50 years of nobody knowing it. And if you've ever been failed by a system that was supposed to protect you, if you've ever been told there's nothing I can do by someone who could have done something, type the word seen in the comments. Type it for Neely. Because in the next few minutes, somebody is finally going to see him. Don't you dare skip it. The tall man sat in the Cadillac across the street for 20 minutes before he moved. Witnesses later said it looked like he was arguing with himself. Twice his hand went to the door, twice it came back to the wheel, because the truth is, even a brave man has to talk himself into the thing that's going to cost him. Then he got out. He didn't hurry. He crossed the wet street in a grey overcoat. A man so big, the people on the steps fell quiet without knowing why, and he sat down, right there, on the cold concrete, in his good coat, in the rain, next to the blind man with the tin cup. For a long moment he didn't say anything. He just sat. Then he spoke, low and slow, in a voice that filled the space without ever rising. Hill 717. Tell me about a soldier you carried off that hill. White boy, tall, left leg torn up bad. Would have been the 9th or 10th man you went back for. Kept apologizing to you for being heavy. Neely went very still. His ruined face turned toward the voice. Who's asking? Man who owes you more than he's got. There was a boy, Neely said slowly. Number 10. Tore up bad in the leg. He kept saying sorry the whole way down, like getting shot was rude of him. His voice cracked. I never knew if he made it. I went out for an 11th man, and that's the last thing I ever saw. He made it. The tall man's jaw was working. He made it home. Married a girl from Bakersfield. 2 daughters. He lost the leg, but he made it, and he lived 7 more years, and he died of something else last spring, with his girls holding his hands. And every Christmas of those 7 years, he wrote a letter to a medic he only knew as preacher, wrote it to the army, to the VA, anywhere he could think of, trying to find the man who carried him off that hill. He never found you. The blind man's hand was shaking on the lip of the tin cup. That boy, the tall man said, was my sister-in-law's brother. He was family. I sat at his table at Thanksgiving. I watched him teach my niece to fish, standing on one leg in a river. And the only thing he ever asked of any of us, the only thing in 7 years, was that if we ever found the medic called Preacher, we tell him thank you. The big man's voice dropped to almost nothing. Took me 8 months and a private detective to put a name to Preacher, and the name led here, to these steps, to a tin cup, to this. Now understand what this man could have done. He could have walked away clean. He could have. He was due on a soundstage in 3 days. A studio was burning thousands of dollars a day waiting on him. He had a wife asking when he'd be home, and a chartered plane sitting at the field with the engines warm. He'd already done the thing he came to do. He'd said the thank you. He'd discharged the family debt. He could have left $100 in the cup and driven away knowing he'd kept his word to a dead man. Nobody on earth would have called it anything but generous. But instead, he reached down, picked up the tin cup, and emptied it into his own coat pocket. Coins, cardboard and all. "You're done begging," he said. "Get up. We're going to go fix this." And here is where the story stops being a kindness and becomes a war. Because the tall man did not just hand Neely Foss money. Money was the easy part. The tall man walked him up those steps and back into Howard Beckworth's office, and he sat the blind man down in the chair, and he stood behind it like a wall, and he said, "This man is owed a pension. You're going to tell me exactly what the paper needs, and then you're going to watch me get it, and then you're going to pay him every dollar this country has owed him for 7 years. Beckworth started his speech. The file, the names, the process that assumes you have help. "He has help now," the tall man said. "Make your list." And the tall man went to work like a man laying siege to a fort. He used the hall telephone for 2 hours straight. He called a general he'd done a war bond tour with in 1944, and the general called the Army Records Depot, and a clerk who would never have moved for a blind beggar moved very fast for a 2-star general, and the field hospital log was pulled, and it confirmed in writing that Cornelius Ross and Cornelius Foss were the same blinded medic. The wet pencil error, 8 years old, killed in an afternoon by a phone call from a man important enough to be answered. He had a Memphis attorney drive over and notarize the affidavit before sundown. He paid for all of it, in cash, on the spot. Then he turned to the second crime, the stolen land, because the tall man had listened. He'd heard Neely say the deed had vanished, and a deed doesn't vanish, somebody removes it. So he made one more call to a man he trusted in Mississippi and asked a simple, dangerous question. Who bought 40 acres of Foss land at a tax auction in 1952, and how fast did the deed go missing afterward? Then he knelt down to Neely's level and pressed something into the blind man's hand. It was Neely's own dog tag. The detective had recovered it from the dead boy's effects, the boy who'd carried it 7 years as the only trace of his preacher. The tag was warped, half melted, fused at one edge to the boy's own bronze star, the two pieces of metal welted together by the same shell that had caught them both on the hill. "This is yours," the tall man said. "He kept it 7 years trying to find you. He never did. Now you keep it for him." He closed Neely's fingers around the warm, ruined metal. "And I'll ask you one thing. Just one. When this is done, and it is going to be done, you don't let what they did to you make you small. You build something. You put your name back on the world. And someday, when somebody asks who pulled you off these steps, you tell them, a man who owed a debt to a soldier you saved. That's all. Pass it on. Have you ever watched the right thing finally happen and felt your chest go tight because some part of you had stopped believing it could? Have you ever been so worn down by being told no that you forgot what yes even sounded like? Have you ever wondered how many heroes are sitting on steps right now in some city with nobody important enough to make the phone ring? Because that's the whole secret, isn't it? It was never that the system couldn't be moved. It's that it only moves for people who matter to someone who matters. The tragedy of Neely Foss isn't that the rules were cruel. It's that they could have bent all along and never did until the right man sat down on a cold step in the rain. But the system was not done with Neely Foss yet, and neither was the man who'd sat down beside him. Here's where you'd expect the story to end. Hero fixes the paperwork. Pension comes through. Roll credits. It almost didn't. Because 3 weeks later, with the army correction filed and the affidavit notarized, and everything the system had demanded sitting on Howard Beckworth's desk, the claim was denied again. A different reason this time. A backlog. A regional supervisor's countersignature missing. A new form issued in the interval that had quietly superseded the old form. The system, cornered, did what cornered systems do. It grew a new wall, and Neely, who had let himself hope for the first time in 7 years, sat in the boarding house the tall man had paid for and felt the dark close back in, worse than before, because now he had something to lose. He told the landlady he should never have let himself believe it. A blind man learns not to believe in light, he said. He'd forgotten the lesson, and it cost him. But the tall man was not in California yet. When the second denial came, the tall man did something the bureaucracy never saw coming. He didn't make another polite phone call. He got on a plane to Washington, D.C., and he walked in person into a marble building where a member of the congressional committee that controlled the Veterans Administration's budget kept an office. The congressman's secretary nearly dropped her coffee. The congressman himself came out fast, all teeth, hand already extended, because 2 years before he had been delighted to have his photograph taken, shaking this exact famous hand at a benefit for the Red Cross, and that photo still hung on his wall. "Well, I'll be," the congressman said. "To what do I owe?" The tall man did not shake the hand. He set Neely's file on the desk. He set the warped dog tag fused to the bronze star on top of it, and he said, low and slow, the way he said everything, "That belongs to a man named Cornelius Foss. He carried 11 Americans off a hill in Korea and lost his eyes doing it. Your VA has told him no for 7 years over one wet pencil mark. 3 weeks ago, I helped him fix every piece of paper they asked for. Last week, they invented a new piece of paper and told him no again. He tapped the fused metal. I'd hate for the newspapers to run a photograph of a blind Bronze Star combat medic begging on the steps of a VA hospital, with a quote from the congressman who oversees that hospital's budget, explaining why the man had to beg. Wouldn't you hate that, Congressman? I think you'd hate that more than I would." The congressman looked at the file and the fused metal and the famous man who had not shaken his hand, and he understood that the photo on his wall had just become a debt. "Let me," he said carefully, "make some calls. Cornelius Foss's pension was approved in 4 days. Full, total, permanent disability, and 7 years of back pay, every dollar paid at once. No more walls. The system, it turned out, had always been able to do it in 4 days. It had simply never had a reason to. And then came the part nobody expected. The land. The tall man's man in Mississippi had found the answer to the dangerous question. The 40 acres had been bought at the 1952 tax auction by the brother-in-law of a Coahoma County clerk named Earl Pickett, the same clerk in whose office the original Foss deed had so conveniently vanished. It was theft, dressed up in official stamps and a Tuesday morning handshake, and faced with a lawyer, a reconstructed paper trail, and a cash buyout offer with real steel behind it. The brother-in-law sold the 40 acres back rather than have the whole arrangement examined in a courtroom, every furrow of it. By spring, Cornelius Foss, who had spent 11 days on a concrete step with a tin cup, owned his grandfather's land again, free and clear, with 7 years of back pension in the bank, and a new deed in his name, recorded in the very county that had erased him, and the tall man was gone before any of it cleared. He'd done one more thing on that very first day, before the sieges and the flights and the 4-day miracles. He'd put Neely Foss in the Cadillac and driven him the 200 miles home to Mississippi himself. In the dark, a blind man and a stranger on a cold winter highway. They didn't talk much. The tall man wasn't built for small talk, and Neely was too stunned for it. The tires hummed, the heater ticked. Somewhere south of the state line, Neely finally said, "Mister, I can't see your face. I can't even thank you proper. Least you can do is tell me your name, so I can put it in my prayers." The tall man drove a while before he answered. "I'm just a fellow who owed a debt to a soldier you saved," he said. "That's all that matters about me. You put his name in your prayers. The boy from the hill. You remember him, and that squares us." He helped the blind man down at his cousin's house at the edge of Coahoma County. He pressed a thick envelope of cash into Neely's hand for the lean weeks before the pension cleared. He stood a moment in the cold with his hand on the blind man's shoulder, the way you'd steady a horse, and then he got back in the Cadillac and drove off into the dark. A neighbor boy, maybe 10, had come out into the yard to gawk at the biggest car he'd ever seen. He swore for the rest of his life that he had seen John Wayne climb back behind that wheel. Nobody ever believed him. They told him he'd seen a movie too recent and dreamed the rest. Neely never told a soul the voice he'd ridden beside, because he could not name the face he'd never seen. He had only the voice, the warped dog tag, and the certainty that an angel built like a barn door had reached down and pulled him out of the dark, the exact way he had once pulled 11 men out of fire. Cornelius Foss did exactly what the stranger asked. He did not let it make him small. He farmed his grandfather's 40 acres for the rest of his life, a blind man by feel and by memory and by the help of every child in the county, who took turns being his eyes for the simple joy of being near him. He used the back pay to do the thing he had dreamed of as a boy and could never reach. He could not be a doctor himself, so he sent other people's children to become doctors. Over 30 years, quietly, never bragging, the Foss farm put 19 Delta kids through nursing school and medical school. He kept the warped dog tag and the fused bronze star on a nail by his front door and touched them every single morning before he stepped outside. He married, late, a schoolteacher named Ruth, who read to him every night for 22 years. They had a daughter. He died in 1991 at 70, on his own land with his family around him. The whole county came to bury him. black and white in a corner of Mississippi where that still did not happen easily, because the blind man had quietly become the moral center of the place, without ever meaning to be anything but a farmer who paid his debts. His daughter became a nurse, one of the 19 in spirit. She had watched her father send the others and decided to be one herself. She kept the rule the stranger gave, though she only half knew where it came from. Don't let them make you small. Pass it on. And then came the granddaughter. Her name was Foss, born in 1968. She grew up at her blind grandfather's knee, his big hands resting on her face to read her smile, his voice telling her about a hill in Korea and a stranger in the rain. She used to ask him who the man in the car had been, and Neely would only say, a fellow who owed a debt. The best kind of man there is, the kind who pays a debt nobody alive could have made him pay. Adazi became a doctor, not just a doctor. In 2009, she became the first black woman appointed chief of ophthalmology, the medicine of the eyes at the Memphis Veterans Administration Hospital. The same hospital, the one with the steps, the one that had turned her blind grandfather away for 7 years. She spent her career giving sight back to veterans on the very ground where her grandfather had once sat with a tin cup, locked out. She never once climbed those front steps without thinking of him, and she made certain with the full weight of her position that no blind veteran was ever again left sitting on them. As for the men who failed him, they faded, the way such men do. Howard Beckworth, the adjudicator with the flat voice, retired in 1968 and died, unremarkable, in 1979. He helped no other heroes and harmed no more, which is the most that can be said for a man who spent his life being a wall. Earl Pickett, the clerk who stole the deed, was quietly forced out of the courthouse in a different scandal in 1961 and died broke and bitter, his name a thing his own children stopped saying. The system that failed Neely was reformed, decades later, by people who never knew his name, except one of them did. Adaze cited his case by name in testimony before a congressional subcommittee on veterans' claims in 2011. Cornelius Foss, Hill 717, Bronze Star, made to beg on the steps of the hospital that owed him everything. But for 54 years, nobody knew who had pulled him off those steps. The warped dog tag and the fused bronze star hung by the farmhouse door the whole time, and inside Neely's old fireproof box, the same kind of box that had once held the stolen deed, there was a sealed letter nobody had opened. On the front, in Ruth's handwriting, taken down from her blind husband's dictation in the last year of his life, it read, "To whoever asks who drove me home." In 2014, Adaze Foss was preserving the old farmhouse, and she opened her grandfather's fireproof box. Inside was the deed to the 40 acres, restored to the family in 1960. There was the warped dog tag fused to the bronze star, and there was the sealed letter in her grandmother's hand, dictated by a blind man who never saw what he was confessing. She opened it at the kitchen table, where her grandfather had eaten in the dark for 30 years. In it, Neely told the whole story, the 11 days on the step, the tin cup, the voice that sat down beside him in the rain, the boy he had carried off Hill 717, the war the stranger waged against the VA, and the county to give him back his pension and his land, the 200-mile drive home in the dark. Neely had never seen the man. He could not describe a face. He had carried the mystery his whole life as a thing he could feel but never look at. But in his last year, a visiting veteran had come to the farm, an old man who had been on those Memphis steps in January of 1960, 11 days running, and who had watched all of it. And that old man finally told Neely the thing Neely had never been able to see for himself, the man who had sat down beside him in the rain, the man who had emptied his tin cup into his own coat pocket and said, "You're done begging," the man who had driven him 200 miles home in the dark and refused to give his name. It was John Wayne. Adaze read the name aloud in the empty kitchen, and then she could not speak for a long time. Today, the warped dog tag fused to the bronze star does not hang by the farmhouse door anymore. Adaze gave it, together with the restored deed and her grandfather's letter, to the Veterans Valor Museum in Memphis, not far from the hospital where she still works. She placed it in the case herself. She asked that it face the windows toward the front steps of the old VA building visible across the way, so that the morning light would fall on it from the exact direction her grandfather had, once faced with a tin cup and a strip of cardboard that said, "I can still work." The placard reads, "Dog tag and bronze star fused by mortar fire, Hill 717, Korea, 1952." awarded to a combat medic who carried 11 men out of enemy fire and lost his sight, denied his pension for 7 years and forced to beg outside this hospital. He was found in January 1960 by a stranger who restored his benefits, recovered his stolen family land, and drove him home, and asked nothing in return but that he never let it make him small. The stranger refused to give his name. At the family's request, it is left off this plaque, the way he wanted it. That is all it says, no name. The museum offered more than once to add it. The family said no. When the curator asked Adawe's why, she said her grandfather had left instructions in the letter, and her mother had honored them, and now she would too. He sat down on a cold step next to a man the whole world had trained itself to walk past, she said. He gave him back his name, his land, and his dignity, and then he drove off into the dark without leaving his own. A man like that doesn't want it on a plaque. He didn't do it to be known. He wanted my grandfather to stand up straight, and my grandfather stood up straight for 50 more years and sent 19 children to heal people and raised me. So we'll give that man what he asked for. We'll keep his name the way he left it. So the warped metal sits in the morning light, facing the steps where a blind hero once begged, and the school children and the old veterans lean in close to the glass, and they ask who the stranger was, and the answer beside it is the same one he gave on a dark Mississippi highway in 1960, just a fellow who owed a debt to a soldier he saved. And it is enough. If this story reached you tonight, do me a favor, pass it on. Share it with a veteran, with a nurse, with anyone who was ever told there's nothing I can do by someone who could have done something. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. There are more Duke stories coming every night at midnight, and unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.